There is a particular kind of wakefulness that most people only discover in the second half of life. It arrives without warning, usually sometime between 2 and 4 in the morning. You are not dreaming. You are not sick. The room is quiet, the house is still, and there is no obvious reason for your eyes to be open. But they are, and they will remain open for longer than you would like. You lie there, listening to the sound of your own breathing. You watch the ceiling. You notice the small sounds of the house, a pipe settling, the hum of the refrigerator, a car passing slowly outside. The world is asleep, and you are not. For younger people, this is an occasional inconvenience. For many people over 60, it has become a familiar companion, something you have begun to expect, even if you have never quite accepted it. And somewhere in that quiet, something shifts. It is not just tiredness. It is a sense that something has changed without your permission. Sleep used to be simple. You closed your eyes, you drifted away, and you woke in the morning rested, or at least restored. That was the deal. Nobody questioned it. It simply happened. And then, somewhere in your 50s or 60s, for many people, gradually, and for others almost suddenly, the deal changed. The nights grew lighter. The awakenings multiplied. The deep, unbroken rest that you had always taken for granted became something you began to notice only in its absence. It is one of the quieter losses of aging. Not dramatic enough to put on a list of symptoms. Not visible enough for others to see. But felt, every morning, in the body that does not quite feel rested, and in the mind that has been working, quietly and relentlessly, through the hours when it was supposed to be still. Many people mention this to their doctors and receive a few words in return. A phrase like, "It is normal with age," or "Many people experience this." And perhaps those words are true. But there is something in them that feels incomplete. Knowing that something is common is not the same as understanding why it happens. And understanding why does not, on its own, tell you what to do with it. This is what this conversation is about. Not a guide to sleep hygiene. Not a list of tips and supplements. Not a promise that everything will go back to the way it was. Instead, this is an attempt to understand what is actually happening when the nights grow harder, biologically, emotionally, and in the quieter philosophical sense of what it means to lie awake in the dark when you are older. Because sleep, it turns out, is not just rest. It is a relationship. And like many relationships in life, it changes as we age. Not always for the worse, but differently. And understanding that difference is the beginning of something genuinely useful. So tonight, or this afternoon, or whenever you are watching this, let us go slowly. Let us look at why the nights change, what those changes are doing to the people living through them, and what the darkness of those early morning hours might actually be asking of us. To understand why sleep gets harder with age, it helps to know something about what sleep actually is. Not in the vague sense of unconsciousness, but in the biological sense of what the body is doing during those hours. Sleep is not a single state. It is a cycle that repeats several times through the night, moving through distinct stages that serve different purposes. The early stages are lighter sleep, the transition between waking and deeper rest. Then comes deep sleep, sometimes called slow-wave sleep, which is the most physically restorative phase. And then there is REM sleep, the phase associated with dreaming, emotional processing, and the consolidation of memory. Each stage has a role. Each one matters. In a young adult, this cycle works efficiently. Deep sleep is generous, arriving reliably in the early part of the night. REM sleep builds through the later hours. The architecture is clean and regular. With age, that architecture changes, and it begins changing earlier than most people expect. Research suggests that measurable shifts in sleep structure begin as early as the 40s. By the time a person reaches their 60s or 70s, the changes are substantial. The most significant shift is the reduction in deep sleep. That profoundly restorative phase, the sleep that feels like falling into a dark, still pool, becomes shorter and lighter. Some research suggests that adults in their 60s and 70s get roughly half the slow-wave sleep of a young adult. The body still cycles through sleep stages, but the deepest point of that cycle becomes shallower with every passing decade. This is why many older people describe the feeling of having slept but not quite rested. Technically, the hours are there. The body was in bed, but the depth was not. And depth is what the body actually needs to repair itself, consolidate memory, and feel restored in the morning. At the same time, the sleep cycle becomes more fragile. The transitions between stages become easier to disrupt. A noise that a younger sleeper would pass through without waking becomes enough to pull an older person fully back to consciousness. A moment of discomfort, a hip, a shoulder, the need to use the bathroom, interrupts the cycle in a way it once would not have. The system is still functioning, but it has become lighter, more reactive, more easily disturbed. The body also changes its internal clock. The circadian rhythm, the biological signal that governs when we feel tired and when we feel awake, shifts with age in a consistent direction. Older adults tend to feel sleepy earlier in the evening and to wake earlier in the morning. This is not a preference or a habit. It is a biological change in how the body reads time. Some researchers call it an advance in sleep phase, and it is nearly universal in older populations. This shift creates a particular problem. If a person feels genuinely tired at 8 in the evening but resists sleep to maintain a normal social schedule, they may lie down later, but they will still wake at 4 or 5 in the morning, simply because the biological clock has run its course. The night becomes shorter not because of insomnia in the clinical sense, but because the body's internal timing has quietly moved on without asking permission. Hormones play a significant role as well. Melatonin, the signal that tells the body it is time to sleep, is produced in smaller quantities as we age. The body still produces it, but the signal is quieter, less insistent. The transition to sleep becomes less automatic. You can feel tired and still find that sleep does not arrive as quickly or as completely as it once did. The door is open, but the path through it is narrower. Cortisol, the hormone associated with alertness and the stress response, can also behave differently in older adults, sometimes rising earlier in the morning than expected and contributing to those early, unavoidable awakenings that feel so final. That moment around 4 or 5 in the morning when the body simply declares itself done with sleep, whether the mind agrees or not. For women, the years around menopause bring an additional layer of disruption that deserves to be spoken plainly. Hot flashes, night sweats, and hormonal volatility can fragment sleep profoundly during that transition, and for some women, the disruption does not resolve quickly. It continues for years, sometimes decades, reshaping the relationship with night in ways that no one warned them about. This is not a minor inconvenience. For many women, it is one of the most significant changes of midlife, and it receives far less attention than it deserves. For men, changes in hormonal balance play their own quieter role in altering sleep quality, though often more gradually and less dramatically. What is worth understanding is that none of these changes operates in isolation. The advancing circadian rhythm shortens the night at both ends. The reduction in deep sleep makes the hours less restorative. The fragility of the sleep cycle means those shortened, lighter hours are further interrupted. Hormonal shifts reduce the body's ability to find its way back to deep rest after an awakening. And each disruption, however small, makes the next one more likely, because the lighter you are sleeping, the less it takes to pull you fully awake. The result is a system under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, and the body manages as best it can, cycling through lighter sleep, managing more awakenings, doing what it is designed to do. It simply does it with fewer of the resources it once had. This is why the response that sleep is just part of aging is, while technically accurate, so incomplete. It is as if someone explained that a river runs slower in a dry season by simply saying that rivers slow down sometimes. True enough, but not nearly enough to help you understand the season you are actually in. And then there are medications. Many of the most commonly prescribed drugs for people over 60, blood pressure medications, diuretics, antidepressants, antihistamines, steroids, certain heart medications list sleep disruption among their side effects. Some cause nighttime awakenings. Others suppress REM sleep. Others simply alter the balance of brain chemistry in ways that make deep rest less accessible. When a person is taking 3 or 4 medications simultaneously, the cumulative effect on sleep can be substantial. And often, nobody connects the new pill to the new difficulty sleeping. It simply becomes part of the background, another unnamed feature of the night. And the body itself changes in ways that disrupt rest. Sleep apnea, the repeated pause in breathing during sleep, becomes more common with age, and it is significantly underdiagnosed, particularly in women. Restless leg syndrome, which causes an uncomfortable urge to move the legs during rest, affects a meaningful percentage of older adults and is often described as maddening. The body refusing to be still precisely when stillness is most needed. Chronic pain, arthritis, back problems, nerve discomfort, makes lying still for 8 hours an act of considerable endurance rather than the passive surrender it is supposed to be. Put all of this together, and the picture becomes clear. Sleep in older age is not simply less restful because of habit or attitude or a failure of discipline. It is less restful because the biology of sleep changes fundamentally with age. The system that once ran quietly in the background requires more attention, more management, and more patience. And for most people, nobody explained this. They simply noticed that the nights had changed, assumed something was wrong with them personally, and added the worry to the already considerable list of things they carry into the dark. There is a difference between knowing that sleep changes with age and living inside that change every day. The understanding does not dissolve the tiredness. It does not make the morning easier. It does not quiet the irritability that arrives by early afternoon when the body has been running on 3 fragmented hours of genuine rest. Understanding is useful, but it does not substitute for sleep, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The daily cost of disrupted sleep in older adults is real, and it is underreported. Not because it is invisible, but because it is normalized by medicine, by culture, and by the people experiencing it themselves, who have learned not to complain about something that everyone tells them is simply expected. The most immediate cost is cognitive. Sleep is when the brain consolidates memory, processes information, and clears the metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. When that process is regularly interrupted, the effects on thinking and memory are measurable and felt. Words become harder to retrieve. They are there, somewhere, but the path to them is slower, less reliable. Conversations require more effort. The ability to concentrate on a task narrows. The mind feels foggy in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it, but unmistakable to the person living inside it. For many older adults, this cognitive fog triggers a specific and painful fear. The fear of dementia. When you forget the word you were looking for, or lose track of a thought mid-sentence, or find yourself standing in a room without knowing why you entered it, the mind goes immediately to the darkest explanation. And that fear, the anxiety about what the forgetting means, burns more mental energy, creates more stress, and makes the next night even harder to navigate. This is one of the cruelest features of sleep disruption in older age. It creates a loop that is genuinely difficult to exit. Poor sleep causes cognitive symptoms. Those symptoms trigger anxiety. That anxiety makes sleep harder to reach. The next night is more fragmented. The cognitive symptoms worsen. The anxiety deepens. And so it continues, each element feeding the others in a cycle that has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with how the nervous system responds to perceived threat. Sleep researchers have a name for the pattern where the worry about sleep becomes its own obstacle to sleeping. They call it psychophysiological insomnia. The person who once fell asleep easily now approaches bedtime with a quiet dread, a sense of performance, of needing to succeed at something that used to happen automatically. They lie down and monitor themselves. They check the clock. They calculate how many hours they will have if they fall asleep right now. And all that monitoring sends a clear signal to the nervous system: stay alert. which is precisely the opposite of what sleep requires. Mood suffers in ways that are hard to separate from the fatigue itself. Irritability arrives more quickly, patience shortens, small frustrations that would once have passed without much notice become harder to absorb. The emotional buffer that sleep provides, that resilience that makes it possible to face difficulty without crumbling, becomes thinner. The world feels heavier not because anything particular has happened, but because the body is simply depleted. For people who live alone, the combination of tiredness and emotional rawness can deepen isolation in ways that are hard to see clearly from inside them. When you are exhausted, social effort feels too costly. A phone call requires energy you do not have. A visit requires preparation and presence that the tired mind cannot easily summon. And so the person retreats, not out of preference, not out of antisocial feeling, but out of simple depletion. And the retreat itself adds to the sense that life has quietly contracted. For people who live with a partner, disrupted sleep can strain even stable relationships. One person's insomnia is rarely only theirs. The movements in the night, the light turned on in the small hours, the early rising, these things travel through a shared bedroom. And when both partners are sleeping poorly, as often happens after decades of a shared life where both bodies are aging in parallel, the combination of two tired and emotionally reduced people trying to navigate daily life together can create friction that has nothing to do with the relationship itself and everything to do with the simple shortage of rest. Healthcare anxiety rises at night. In the dark, with nothing to distract the mind, the body becomes more present to itself. An ache that was ignorable during a busy afternoon becomes significant at 2 in the morning. A symptom that seemed minor at dinner becomes something to carefully examine at 3. The mind, running in the quiet with nothing to anchor it, finds things to think about, and it finds them in the body. Every sensation becomes a question. Every question becomes a possible answer that must be thought through before sleep can be considered again. There is something particular about the tiredness that follows disrupted sleep in older age that is worth naming. It is different from the tiredness of a young person who stayed up too late. That tiredness is acute, it arrives, it is felt, and with a good night's rest, it passes completely. The tiredness that builds from months or years of fragmented sleep is cumulative in a different way. It does not feel like a single deficit waiting to be repaid. It feels more like a gradual lowering of the baseline, as though the floor has dropped, quietly and without announcement, and the day now begins from a lower place than it once did. This makes it harder to name and harder to complain about. There is no single terrible night to point to. There is only the steady accumulation of mornings that were not quite right, days that required more effort than they should have, evenings when the body gave out before the day was truly done. It accumulates in the self-image as well. The person who cannot sleep as well as they once did begins to wonder whether they are aging faster than expected. Whether the tiredness means something beyond itself. Whether the life they are living is smaller than it used to be, not dramatically, not in any way that would be easy to explain to someone else, but in the quiet arithmetic of energy that does not quite add up at the end of each day. And then the morning arrives. Not with the feeling of restoration that sleep is supposed to deliver, but with the quiet heaviness of something managed rather than resolved. You got through the night. You are here, but you are not quite rested, and you know it, and you will know it all day. This is not drama. This is not complaint. It is simply the texture of life for millions of people who are navigating something that medicine understands in mechanical terms but culture has largely forgotten to acknowledge in human ones. There is something worth considering that lies beyond the biology, beyond the hormones and the circadian rhythms and the fragmented sleep cycles. It is this. Lying awake at night, when you are older, is often not simply a failure of the body's sleep system. It is also an experience of a different kind of consciousness, a particular quality of attention that the waking mind brings to the hours when everything else is still. And understanding that is, perhaps, as important as understanding any of the biology. This is not a comfortable idea, and it is not meant to romanticize insomnia or pretend that the exhaustion is not real. It is. But it is also worth asking what happens in those hours, and whether part of what makes them difficult is not only the tiredness they create but what they make unavoidable to confront. In midlife and beyond, the mind carries a different kind of inventory than it did at 30. It carries the weight of choices made and unmade. It carries awareness of time, not in the abstract way that younger people understand time, as something limitless ahead of them, but in the concrete and personal way that comes from having lived enough of it to feel its passage in the body. At 3 in the morning, there is no email to distract you. There is no television, no conversation, no task to complete, no screen to reach for. There is only you, and the dark, and the mind doing what minds do when they have nowhere to run. And what they often do, in those hours, is account. They account for relationships, the ones that have flourished and deepened, the ones that have cooled over years of distance or neglect, the ones that ended in ways that still carry a small persistent ache. They account for money, whether there is enough, whether the decisions made decades ago were wise, whether the future feels as secure as it needs to feel. They account for the body, whether the ache in the shoulder is nothing, whether the shortness of breath last week was something worth noting, whether the doctor's appointment next month will bring good news or complicated news or the beginning of something that will need to be managed. And sometimes the accounting goes deeper than any of those specific things. Older adults lying awake in the small hours are sometimes doing something that younger people rarely have reason to do. They're thinking about their own mortality in a way that is not theoretical. Not as a distant concept to be studied or imagined, but as something that is measurable now, in the gray of the hair, in the creaking of the joints, in the funerals attended over the past decade, in the names of friends who are no longer there to call. This is not morbid, it is honest, and it is, in a real sense, one of the legitimate tasks of later life, to begin to sit with the fact of finitude in a way that integrates it rather than runs from it. To learn to hold the awareness of an ending without being undone by it. Sleep, with its daily practice of letting go of consciousness, has always been understood in many cultures as a small rehearsal for exactly that kind of surrender. You release, you trust, you give the mind over to something you cannot control, and you trust that morning will come. For younger people, that surrender is easy because the stakes feel low. The body is strong, the future is long, and letting go for 8 hours carries no real weight. For older people, the surrender can feel harder, not because they are afraid of sleep itself, but because the act of letting go has acquired a different gravity. The mind that has more to account for is also a mind that is more reluctant to stop accounting. It keeps the books through the night because it has not yet found a way to trust that the figures will be acceptable. And so it works, quietly, relentlessly, in the hours when the rest of the world has put the work down. There is also something that modern life does very poorly, which is to provide any cultural language for the legitimate wakeful hours of older age. Many cultures throughout history understood that the night belongs differently to different seasons of life. The monastic tradition of praying in the small hours, the office of vigils, the night prayers, was built on the understanding that certain hours between midnight and dawn carry a quality of attention that daylight does not. Many indigenous traditions recognized the particular insight of the elders who sat with the fire while others slept. There was an understood relationship between age and a certain kind of wakefulness, not pathology, but awareness. We have lost that understanding almost entirely. The closest thing modern society offers to a framework for nighttime wakefulness in older age is the language of disorders, insomnia, fragmented sleep, early morning awakening. These are clinical descriptions, and they have their place. But they carry an implicit judgment. They say, "This is a malfunction. Something has gone wrong with you, and the goal is to return you to the norm." What they do not carry is the older understanding, that the norm itself changes with age, and that a changed relationship with night is not automatically a broken one. That the person lying awake at 70 is not simply a failed version of the person who slept easily at 30. They are a different person, at a different season, with a different relationship to time and consciousness and the quiet. In its place, we now have sleep hygiene checklists and pharmaceutical options, and the general cultural message that if you are not sleeping 8 unbroken hours, you have a problem that needs to be fixed, optimized, or medicated. Wakefulness in older age is treated as a malfunction rather than a possibility. But perhaps some of what happens in those waking hours is not a failure. Perhaps the mind that wakes at 3 in the morning to do its accounting is doing something appropriate to its season. Something that the young and busy and distracted mind does not have the stillness to do. Perhaps the thoughts that arrive in the dark are not interruptions to be managed away, but conversations that deserve to be heard, slowly and carefully and without the rush that daylight demands. This does not mean that suffering is wisdom. Sleep deprivation is real, and its costs are real, and a person who is genuinely losing their health to chronically disrupted rest should seek medical attention without shame or hesitation. The biology matters and should be taken seriously. But it does mean that not all wakefulness is failure. Some of it is the mind doing the work that the day does not allow. Some of it is the honest reckoning that comes with having lived long enough to have something worth reckoning with. And the question worth sitting with, slowly, in the quiet of one of those wakeful nights, is whether we can learn to tell the difference between the wakefulness that needs to be addressed and the wakefulness that needs to be understood. And whether we can extend to ourselves the patience that the long dark hours seem, in their silence, to ask of us. The honest thing to say at the end of all of this is that there is no return to the sleep of youth. The body changes, and some of those changes are permanent. The goal, the realistic, useful, honest goal, is not to restore what was, but to find a reasonable peace with what is. That is not resignation, it is clarity, and clarity is often the first step towards something genuinely better. For people struggling with sleep in older age, the most useful shift is often not behavioral but perceptual. The person who lies in bed at 3 in the morning calculating the hours of sleep remaining is feeding anxiety that feeds wakefulness. The person who can be in that same situation and simply think, I am resting, even if I am not sleeping. I am here, and the morning will come, is giving the nervous system something different to work with. Not a trick, not a false comfort, simply the withdrawal of the signal that tells the body there is danger. This is not easy. It requires practice, and it requires a certain willingness to stop treating wakefulness as an emergency. But it is possible, and it tends to be more useful than most of what is advertised on the internet. Understanding the biology helps as well. When you know that waking at 4 in the morning is partly a function of a shifted circadian rhythm rather than something wrong with you personally, the waking feels different. It has a cause. It fits a pattern that millions of people share. When you understand that lighter sleep is a structural change in how the aging body manages rest, the night becomes less frightening. You are not broken. You are changed. Small adjustments help, honestly and modestly. Consistent wake times, even on weekends, help anchor the circadian rhythm. Morning light, taken outside or near a bright window, helps reset the biological clock each day. Limiting the long afternoon nap that feels so necessary but borrows hours from the night. Reducing the evening alcohol that helps you fall asleep but fragments the second half of the night in ways you feel in the morning. These are not dramatic interventions. They are quiet recalibrations. They work modestly, which is to say truthfully, not as cures, but as small, honest adjustments to a system that is doing its best with the materials available. But perhaps the most important thing, the one that does not appear on any sleep hygiene list, is permission. Permission to admit that the nights have changed. Permission to mention it to a doctor without embarrassment. Permission to acknowledge that the tiredness is real and that it matters, without dismissing it as inevitable or exaggerating it into catastrophe. Permission to sit with the thoughts that come in the dark rather than fighting them back with the pillow. And permission, sometimes, to simply be awake, to let the mind do its accounting, to sit with whatever arrives in the quiet, to trust that the stillness of those hours is not entirely without value. That the darkness is not only an absence of rest but also a kind of presence, a space where the mind can do, without interruption, what it has been meaning to do all day. Life changes its texture in the second half. The body requires more patience. The nights require more understanding. And the mind, given enough time and quiet, often finds something in those difficult hours that the busy day does not offer. A kind of honesty, a kind of presence, a kind of stillness that is genuinely hard to come by when the world is loud and the calendar is full. Rest, in the end, is not only what happens when you sleep. It is also what happens when you stop fighting what you cannot change, and begin, slowly and without drama, to understand it.